Carolina Public Press. I'm Peter Kent, the host and producer. Carolina Public Press is an independent, nonprofit news organization dedicated to in-depth and investigative reporting for North Carolina. Today on The Kicker, the 6 amendments. Along with congressional, state, and local races, North Carolina voters will decide state constitutional amendments. The November 6 ballot measures cover a wide range of topics, including protecting victims' rights, safeguarding hunting and fishing, and other measures that will alter the balance of power between the governor and legislators, and deal with voter ID and taxes. Amendment advocates and opponents have been pushing voters to take an all-or-none approach. Politics is rarely that simple. And today on The Kicker, 2 veteran State House reporters will be discussing that via telephone and the politics driving the amendments. Kirk Ross is the Capitol Bureau Chief for Carolina Public Press. He recently wrote a guide to the amendments for Carolina Public Press. Andy Speck is a North Carolina political reporter for the News and Observer in Raleigh and PolitiFact, North Carolina. Andy wrote a story evaluating advertising claims that all North Carolina governors oppose the amendments. That story was produced through the North Carolina Fact-Checking Project, a partnership of McClatchy Carolinas, Duke University Reporters Lab, and PolitiFact. Also with us is Frank Taylor, managing editor of Carolina Public Press. Frank, how are you doing?
Pretty good.
Frank, I'm going to ask you that question again. This time I'm going to turn up your mic. So, how are you doing, Frank?
I'm doing okay.
All right. Why don't you give a little bit of background on this, since I seem to have gotten caught before I made my phone calls to bring these guys in. And I'm going to call Kirk and Andy, and we can take it from there.
Sure. So, we have 6 measures on the North Carolina ballot this fall. They were approved by the General Assembly earlier this year. They cover a range of different issues. I think we'll talk about them in specifics in a little bit. There's a lot of confusion about them and why they're there.
Hi, Andy. I'll be with
So,
you in a second. I have to make a second call.
Our article that we published with
Kirk.
Kirk last week examined that question in depth. What is each of the amendments? Why are they there? But we're seeing a lot of conversation from people who are saying, you should just vote against all of them, or you should vote for all of them. And there's a lot of confusion from voters about why that is. Obviously, some of this is partisan, and people have partisan opinions. We respect that. But for those who want to think for themselves and evaluate each one, they may go down the line and say, I don't like this one, I don't like this one, I don't like this one. They may vote against all of them, or they may do the opposite individually. We want to give them the information they need to make an informed, educated decision as a voter.
Okay, I think I have both guys on the line. Kirk, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Andy, are you there?
I am.
Well, this is a modern telecommunications miracle. I have to admit, you guys are my first. You're my first conference call on the air, and I'm so glad that this has worked out. Frank has been vamping while I've been dialing, and it seems to have all worked out. Frank, can you hear them?
I can hear them, yes. Hopefully our listeners can.
Okay. Well, I'm going to ask Frank to lead things off and ask some of the questions.
Sure.
I think that way you guys can have a conversation and I can keep out of it. So, Frank, it's yours.
Well, Kirk and Andy, thank you both for being with us today. And I want to begin with a question for Kirk. I know you've recently written a piece for Carolina Public Press that appeared last week. Before reading this piece, I had been hearing a lot, I think all of us had, about some of the amendments on the ballot, mostly hearing from people who want me to vote for them or against them. Can you give us kind of a brief rundown of what the amendments, the 6 amendments are?
Yeah, I like to, when I was working on the piece, I tried to think about how to break it down for folks. I could have gone in the order they are on the ballot, but I decided to group them into 2 groups of 3 each, the more controversial ballots or amendments, and then ones that have been kind of around for a while, and they finally made it to the ballot. In the more controversial category, you have a law that or an amendment that would allow the legislature to create rules for a photographic ID that actually require them for voting. Photographic identification would be a requirement for voting. There's also an amendment that would change the current Board of Elections and Ethics Enforcement to the Board of Ethics and Election Enforcement, and eliminate the one nonpartisan member and make it a 4-4 Republican Democrat board, an 8-member board. And I'm not going to get into the controversies right now because I assume we're going to talk about them, but this is just what they do.
Sure.
The third one would change the way the judicial vacancies are filled. Right now they're filled by the governor, generally on recommendation from the local bar. They send some names up to the governor, and the governor fills the judicial vacancy. This would basically put it more in control of the legislature through a separate commission that would come up with the names. Then those are the three that are the most hotly debated and certainly have a lot of the strongest opposition to them. The other three are the right to hunt and fish, which is something I think 22 other states have done something similar to this.
Right.
The most recent batch of them have been basically really similar amendments based on something that the NRA has been pushing, and we get into the details of that as we go through. Another one that is probably the most likely to pass, I would say at this point, is the so-called Marsy's Law or Victims' Rights constitutional amendment, which would, I guess the best way to say it, we have a constitutional amendment saying that victims have a right to participate in judicial proceedings, and it's actually a very extensive amendment passed in the 90s, I believe, early 90s. And this would amend that and further strengthen it, would be and give a little bit more input for crime victims. And then the last one is would cap the state income tax rate, business and personal, at 7%. Just to talk about that one for a second, the state did have a 3-tier rate in 2014. There was a big push, mainly out of the Senate, North Carolina Senate, to reduce income tax rates, and we went to a flat tax rate that is below 7%. But we can get into what that might imply going down the road.
Sure.
So that's the rundown of the six. I will tell you, just in terms of an overview, a couple of things to remember is that almost all of these require enabling legislation, which is sort of a term of art for the voters might approve one of these amendments, but until there's a law that says that lays out how the amendment is going to be carried out. In the case of photo ID, a good example is what types of IDs
Right.
would be available. So there's a lot of devil in the details with this,
Sure.
and we don't have a real clear picture of what the enabling legislation is.
I think when we talked about this last week, one of the one exception to that is the hunting rights one. That one is one that does not require the legislation, but most of the rest of them do.
You mean, did you say the hunting rights?
Yes.
Yeah, that one, I think that is the only one where they really wouldn't have to Well, actually, the cap the income tax rate, they would not have to pass any legislation. It would be sort of a thing where maybe some court cases could come along or something along those lines. But they certainly could pass some kind of legislation off of those amendments, but they're not required, I guess is a good
Gotcha.
way. The other ones all require some kind of legislation follow-on,
Right.
which could come as early as November 27th when they all get back together.
Right. Andy, I've seen a lot of claims on social media and in some advertisements, some of them are I don't know, advertisements that people quote without actually posting the advertisement, so you don't always know what was exactly said when you look at them on social media. But claims saying that all 6 living governors, Republicans and Democrats, are totally against all 6 of these amendments. I know you've written about this. Can you talk to us a little bit about the accuracy of that claim?
Yes. So all 6 living former governors came together for what many believe is an unprecedented press conference where they denounced the 2 constitutional amendments that deal with the governor's powers. One, as Kirk already mentioned, would transfer power away from him, the legislature, and the other had to do with judicial appointments, I should say, and the other deals with the elections board. And so they came out, and they're against 2 of them. But there's a campaign called Nix All 6, where many liberals and Democrats and just people, I guess, across the spectrum oppose all of them. But that's not the case for these with these governors. Now, there was an ad, as you mentioned. There's a group actually called the Stop Deceptive Amendments PAC, Political Action Committee, and they are against all of the ads, but they're using the governors for just 2 of them.
Got you. Trying to understand this whole process a little better. What happens to put these amendments on the ballot? I know I've lived in some other states. I lived in Florida for a while, and there you draw up a petition, and if you get enough signatures, it ends up on the ballot. My understanding is that's not how it works in North Carolina. Can you guys talk to us a little bit about that process?
Well, I'll jump in. And Andy, fix anything I get wrong here. But basically, they're initiated by the legislature. There has to be some kind of legislative act to put them on the ballot. We don't have really an access, direct access to the ballot. It's got to go through our elected officials. And go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say one thing to note would be that the governor plays no role and cannot stop the legislature from putting these amendments on the ballot. His veto powers don't extend to amendments like this.
I see.
Right. Yeah. So, and the some of these have been talked about for years. Hunting and fishing, Marcy's law, capping the tax rate. They had all been talked about for years. Photo ID obviously came about because the previous photo ID provisions in the big sweeping voting law that got shot down by the courts. There was a lot of desire to come back and do that as a standalone. There was a lot of thinking that because it was in that big bill that did a lot of other things that targeted African American voters, as the courts decided that if they came back with a so-called clean voter ID bill, it might pass judicial muster. So, a lot of these had some history, but it was sort of a surprise at the end of the session that 6 of them came out pretty much all at once, and we're going to say right onto the ballot because the Republicans in the legislature had the votes to do it, and this is what they wanted to do. At the time, a lot of this was criticized as a way to drive voter turnout for various constituencies, and so the legislature in the state is pretty much all powerful. There's a few things the governor can get involved in, but when the legislature has the votes, it can do a lot, and that's how all these things got on the ballot.
Okay, and I think we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about what will happen with each of these amendments if they pass. But in general, does anything happen if any of these amendments don't pass, other than them not passing? Anything
They
that
try to pass them again.
there's no urgency then for them. I guess that's what I'm thinking about.
I don't. Andy, you see any?
I'm not aware of anything that would stop them from trying again.
Sure, we just stay with the status quo though if they don't pass, correct?
Yeah, I don't
Correct.
think anything's on fire here.
So, for instance, we're not going to suddenly see hunting banned or see the taxes go to 10% or something, unless there's, it could happen, but in theory, but that's not automatically going to happen if people turn down those amendments.
Yeah, I mean that kind of gets into the amendments themselves a little
Right,
bit. With
right.
hunting and fishing, you may. In other states, there have been some court challenges to some methods or things like this, and things like that, and so you might see some court challenges, and that amendment is specifically aimed at stopping future court challenges to, like I said, various methods that PETA or the Humane Society or other groups may be opposed to. So hunting is a lot more controversial a subject in the legislature than a lot of people get. And I've seen some really heated debates on things like deer farming, cervid farming, and it's one of those issues that means a lot to the folks that are involved in it. So that's why this amendment's happening, I suppose.
Sure. Andy, I know Kirk has mentioned this as we were talking at the beginning as one of the most controversial amendments, but I'm interested in your perspective on the voter ID amendment. Certainly that's one we've heard a lot about. What do you think about this specific amendment? What will it do, and how is it different from some of the things that the legislature's tried before on this?
Andy, before you talk, try to raise your voice a little. We're having a little bit of a lower level than we have with Kirk, so step up to your microphone.
Sure. Well, this, as you mentioned, Republicans in the legislature have tried this before. They would like to require photo ID at the polls. The problem with the last attempt was that when they tried, opponents successfully argued in court that it unfairly disenfranchised minorities, and so here we are again. And this particular amendment is vague, so vague that, as Kirk mentioned, they would have to go back and write a bill if it passes. And so it's hard to tell how the finished product would look in comparison to what they've tried in the past, just because the amendment's vague and there's still more work to do. And to my knowledge, Republicans in charge haven't forecast their intentions for that bill should this amendment pass. So
aside from perhaps bringing out the specific voters that they're targeting with this amendment, the result of this amendment, should it pass, would be, and I mean, I'm not talking about the voters with ID, but the idea that there's an intent with putting amendments on the ballot to recruit voters who feel strongly about those amendments to help them to influence other races. I mean, that's one of the things we alluded to early on. But aside from that, if this amendment were to pass, the effect would not be to insulate a voter ID law in North Carolina from federal courts, only from North Carolina courts. This is the North Carolina Constitution. And so there could still be challenges to whatever they do at the federal level, couldn't there?
Oh, yeah. Well, it'll affect federal elections.
Yeah.
So it definitely, well, it would, the court cases, and I have to say this one is, the three controversial ones are all going to court.
Yeah. If they pass.
I mean, I'd put $1 on that right now. Well, I mean, I guess if they don't pass, they're not going to court. But if they do pass, any law that comes out of those, we'll see another test in court. And it's, there's so many different ways that states have gone at voter ID. In addition to the types of IDs required, there's the whole how easy is it to get an official state ID if it's going to be required? Is it expensive? Anybody who's been to the DMV recently is probably nervous about the idea of what if my driver's license expires and I have to get a new one before I vote, and I don't have 5 hours to stand in line. What are my options there? So the state has to show a pretty good faith that it's trying to at least make IDs available to people. But there's just a whole swath of folks that it would be extremely difficult, disabled individuals, people who it's difficult to travel, people who don't want to be photographed for religious reasons. There has to be some exception, and I think most of the laws that have stood up, there has to be some exceptions for folks who can't obtain or for religious reasons don't get an ID, a photo ID, and how those exceptions are handled. In Louisiana, for instance, you sign an affidavit that says, I am who I am, and, that can be challenged later, but it allows you to vote. So
Yeah.
it really is that Ziva, the law that was in last time, it went on for pages and pages on how it was going to work. And, I think, personally, the big one will be whether people going to state universities or private colleges and universities in the state, whether their IDs, whether student IDs will be accepted, is probably going to be a pretty big issue.
I would imagine we'll see
forward.
some lively debate. I don't know if the votes will be very divided. Depends on what happens in the other elections this coming few weeks. But probably some lively debates about this issue and what that legislation should look like if this passes. And of course, as you say, we're likely headed for court regardless. I wanted to talk to you guys about one of the other more controversial amendments, and it's one that I think we've seen less publicity about, even though it's very controversial. And this is the creation of the Bipartisan Board of Ethics and Elections Enforcement. It's interesting to me that you kind of have to read through it carefully to get to the point that what it's doing away with is the nonpartisan member. One of the fastest growing group of voters in the state are unaffiliated voters. They'll have no voice, as far as I can see, in the makeup of this board that governs ethics and elections. It's like, do politicians really know anything about ethics? Why are they in charge of it? What do you guys think about that?
Go ahead, Kirk. I don't have a fully formed opinion. I think it's a great point to make, though, that it seems to be excluding certain points of view if you only stick with Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to it. Practically, creating a system where there could be a lot of 4-4 ties.
Yes. I don't know
That
why you would create a board
is,
with an even number, but go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. Well, it's if you ask the people who are against this amendment, they will tell you it's specifically to create tie-ups, and the effect of that. If you look, the state board of elections or whoever's controlling elections in the state has to be able to make a decision, and if you have 4-4 ties on lots of issues, things like, as we saw in this election already, things like how early voting is going to work. You had non-unanimous and different plans coming from different counties, and the State Board of Elections had to look at those and make a call. And if there's 4-4 ties, then there's a lot of questions about how some of those early voting disagreements would have been settled, or whether they would have been settled at all. The other thing I want to mention about this is that and Andy talked about this for a second. This particular amendment went to court,
Right.
and got severely trimmed. Legislature had to take a whole section of it out, and that section was what really upset the governors. It basically would have put all state boards and commission appointments directly in the hands of the legislature, and overturned a couple of court cases that the governor, both McCrory and Cooper, won, give them greater authorities, or I would say the court reinforcing the fact that the governor should have the authority over those executive branch boards and commissions. So that got removed
And that was
from
yeah.
this, but the governors are still kind of peeved
yeah.
that they see it as a separation of powers issue.
This was one of the ones, though, that the Republican governors cited against the Republican legislature on. I mean, they don't have any say, but they've come out publicly and said on 2 of these amendments, we're opposed. This was one of them, right?
Yeah.
And
You got to remember,
Right.
I mean, the big court case they're trying to overturn is McCrory v. Berger.
Right.
So, you know, it's,
Yeah. And quickly,
yeah. And they were.
yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, we're running low on time, so I just want to get quickly through a couple of these other amendments to talk about them just briefly. The other amendment that question comes up with is how to fill judicial vacancies. And I know it seems a little confusing to people. I've seen people talking about losing their right to vote for judges. It only addresses vacancies, but it takes it away from the governor, puts it in the hands of the legislature or into a commission created by the legislature. Is that right?
My understanding is that the legislature would narrow down the list of choices for the governor, and so he
Okay.
wouldn't get free reign on who's picked. They would control his options.
I see.
Is
So,
that right,
okay, I
Kirk?
was confused about it.
Yeah. They
Okay.
would send on 2 names, but they would decide who those names are, and they could be, you know, Ronald McDonald and the person they want,
I see.
you know, or something.
Sure.
And one thing to note is that it's a lot of these former governors, Republicans and Democrats alike, are peeved, as Kirk mentioned, because North Carolina, compared to other states, has a relatively weak governor. He doesn't have as much power as governors of other states.
Right.
For one thing, he doesn't have line item vetoes like other governors do.
Right.
And so when what little power you have is attacked, as they see it, then, you know, that, I guess that's when you see the types of press conferences and commercials that we've seen for the last couple months.
Yeah, that was a pretty stunning moment when they all got up and came out against those 2 amendments. I'd never see something like that.
Yeah.
Frank, I want to add one thing. I know we're kind of starting to get to the close, but I do want to just mention to people that one of the things about this is that there's a lot of fallout on the ballot. As voters get farther down the ballot,
Right.
they tend to drop off. And these amendments are at the bottom of the ballot, and they're tedious and they're hard to understand. And I think, you know, part of the strategy on this is for both sides is getting some fight in people. That's why you see this mix all 6 and things like that.
Sure.
Is getting some fight into people, anticipating that it'll only be the folks who really are interested in these things who will get that far down the ballot and vote.
You know, guys, this breaks my heart because this is, I think, really going to be helpful to voters and our listeners to bring this together. But I have to draw it to a close. We've managed to use a half hour very quickly. I want to thank you, Andy Speck, for being here today, and I want to thank Kirk Ross for doing so, and Frank, you've been a great moderator with the questions. I just wish we had more time. So guys, thank you very much, and hope to hear from you again in the near future. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Anytime.
Sure.
Thank
Yeah.
you.